So we're at the 8 o'clock hour. If everybody who's at the bar could get an easy cocktail or drink and mosey on in, we'd love to start this program momentarily. Yeah. Let's give a big Aspen greeting to Kristen Grimm and the rest of the panel tonight, everybody.
Good evening. It is really great to see everybody. We are very honored tonight to have these distinguished guests to talk with us about how we actually become the courageous, brave leaders we need to be right now. So if we were really serious about being fearless, we're going to get some good advice about how to do that. So I want to welcome tonight, first, David Brooks. Of course, everybody knows, the New York Times columnist and author. What you may not know is he's now working at Aspen on a new initiative, which we'll hear a little bit about stopping growing fragmentation and divisiveness. And you're also writing a new book. So you're a busy guy. Indrani Bagchi, you are the diplomatic editor of the Times of India. And last, we have Felix Maradiaga, and he is a leading human rights activist in Nicaragua, and perhaps more importantly, recently survived an assassination attempt. So, Felix, let's start with you. You have clearly been called as a leader, and you have more than stepped up. And you've actually called for leadership to join you in Nicaragua. So tell me about how you came to the decision to put yourself in harm's way, and how other leaders who are watching either in Nicaragua or other unjust governments, and how to think about, is this my time? How do I get my courage?
Well, first of all, thank you for the opportunity. Coming from a small country like Nicaragua in Central America, about the size of New York, 6 million people, we don't get the chance to have such a wonderful platform with leaders from around the world. So it's a humbling experience. So thank you very much. I will not speak too much about myself, but going back to your question, what happened in Nicaragua, I think there is a clear example or a case study of people keeping quiet when all the red flags are there. So Daniel Ortega, a dictator, came into power again in 2006. He established unlimited terms, became an authoritarian leader. And the international community kept quiet. Most of the business sector kept quiet. I was part of the business sector at that time, and I most thank my mentors of the Cali program when I had to step down from a very comfortable life at a private equity firm, and 3 years ago, trying to step away from that comfort zone to move. So sometimes, when you explore into your inner self, when you explore into your consciousness, it's not about being brave. And I would like to introduce the term of moral courage. It's the only moral thing to do. And in my particular case, as I always repeat, I'm not particularly heroic. There are thousands of students in Nicaragua who woke up a country that was sleeping. Mm-hmm. And in my particular case, I am not any more brave than any of those 448 students who and civil society leaders who have been killed. That's approximately one person assassinated by Ortega every 5 hours. So today is the 100th day of the genocide that started on April 18th. So in my case, it was the only moral thing to do, to step in.
Thank you. Indrani, Nelson Mandela said of leaders, you take the front line when there is danger. And we just heard about the front line here, and we see front lines all over the world. Do you see leaders doing that now, and what do you think is holding them back from doing it more?
No, I see leaders doing that in different ways, in different spheres. And certainly in India, leaders crop up from the unlikeliest places. And I think what helps us is the fact that it is a vibrant, thriving democracy. And so yes, there are always excesses of all varieties, and you will find somebody who will always stand up. But what is it that holds people back? Often, let's say in my profession as a journalist, you may be held back from either because of intimidation by politicians, political leaders, governments. And in the Times of India, we don't feel it that much because we're really big. But there are small newspapers where, governments, state governments, local governments, where they would use advertising. We don't have government-controlled media in India. So it's, they would be able to pull out advertising. That is a form of pressure. Corporate leaders, just by the way, if you think governments pressure journalists, you have not seen corporate houses. Corporate houses can pull out advertising, and that's their best way of doing this. They can pull out advertising for years on end, and we've all been through it, and they're actually far more sensitive to criticism than governments. And I've seen this for many years now.
Have you felt in the recent year that you've had to actually change your coverage or consider that when you were thinking about what to cover because you had to think about the corporate pressure, or do you feel like you do what you need to do?
Well, I don't actually feel that because I cover foreign policy and, geopolitics and terrorism and nuclear weapons and stuff. So those are not areas where you really come under pressure. Where you do come under pressure are things where it's domestic politics, where coverage of domestic politics, coverage of corporate news. These are areas where you are most vulnerable to pressure. And yes, we've had an instance a year and a half ago. The group, the Times of India is part of this, is a big group, big media group, and one of our newspapers covered elections in a state, a very important state in India, in a manner that seemed to suggest that they were biased in favor of a particular party. At least the government saw it that way. And we were, the owners of the paper were sort of, they were called in by the Prime Minister's office, not the office, but his political henchmen, to say that, your coverage was not what we thought it should be, considering actually the coverage was all wrong in the sense that the party that the newspaper had projected would win the election didn't get anything. And it is the BJP, which is the ruling party, which won. And so the BJP really, and they pulled out of events where the Prime Minister was supposed to be present. And so we've been through this, but the thing about media in India is you kind of brush it off and move on. We're just too big.
You're too big to fail. Yeah. David, you are asking leaders to weave. And you would not normally think of that as a super high-risk activity, and yet it sounds like they're not all doing the weaving you feel like we need to be doing. So what are you wanting them to do, and what makes it hard to do?
First, I want to say it's humbling to be on the stage with Felix. We Americans invested a lot emotionally in Nicaragua for a little while.
Yes.
And we basically used it as a proxy for our own narcissistic battles with each other. And then we sort of turned their attention away. And I was talking to Margarita about the situation there, and it's sort of involving to think of what we used to care and how it's wrong that we don't pay as much attention now. It's also humbling just because of what you've been through. My best friend in the world is a guy named Jeff Goldberg who covers terrorism. And he used to get kidnapped with some regularity by Hamas and Hezbollah and Al-Qaeda. And he and I sent our kids to the same school, and I was on a panel with him. And I talked about how exciting it was to interview the Commerce Secretary. And he talked about getting kidnapped by 4 or 5 Hamas leaders. And the kids were like riveted to this guy. And I was like, maybe could you arrange like a kidnapping for me, but like nobody serious, like the Bridge Club, somebody who like wouldn't hurt me. So I'm humbled to be in this presence. I can't say I face this kind of courage, but I was reminded of a guy I once knew who was getting interviewed for a job. And at the end of the interview, he turned around to the interviewer and he just said to her, "What would you do if you weren't afraid?" And she started crying because she wouldn't be doing HR at that company. And it strikes you that question, what would you do if you weren't afraid, is a really good question to ask.
Yeah.
Because fear is a surprisingly good GPS system. It tells you what you really want, even if that thing is on the far side of social disapproval. And so it's a question I have come to ask my students at Yale. Every class, I say, what would you do if you weren't afraid? And every year out of the 24 kids in the seminar, I get 2 or 3 who say, I'd drop out of Yale. And to me, one of the common fears and the common things we have to face in order to be fearless is the fear of losing our brand. That they don't want to lose that Yale brand. And a lot of us have managed to attach ourselves to prestigious brands and taken the path that seems like the normal career success that get everybody approving of you at a dinner party, and we're really scared of walking away from that thing. And then the second thing that I think is at the cause of a lot of our fears, and this is really what I'm working on both personally and professionally, is the fear of intimacy. I think one of the things we all fear is disapproval. That we, entering into a relationship, an intimate relationship with anybody, is walking through a series of gates where I unveil this and then you unveil that. If I proceed, will you catch me? If I pause, will you wait for me? If I unveil the darkness that I have, will you hold it and not try to fix it?
Yeah.
And so this is really what courage is in all our lives. And it's sort of a moral test of just this mutual unveiling. And it takes a lot of social courage to do that. And so in personal life and in professional life, I look for people who have the courage to walk through those gates and who basically know how to do it. And I find that in a small way, I've been working on this book for 4 years, and the book will not work unless I tell the reason for the book, which is that I got divorced and I was totally cut loose for a little while. And I've never done anything like that, but I've realized that I have to do that in the book in the past couple weeks. And it's sort of terrifying, but if you're desperate for your book to be okay, then you'll do it. But the thing I think Weave is about is a bigger version of that a lot of what we have in the country is just failure of relationship. And you naturally look at the people you disagree with and hate, and your impulse is to walk away, and it's so much easier. But to unveil yourself through the gates of intimacy toward that person is just a super hard process. And then it takes sort of a moral shift, and I've learned this now on my second marriage, that in marriage, each person has to regard their own selfishness as the key problem. Because the normal instinct is to regard the other person's selfishness as the key problem. But your own selfishness is the one you can really control.
That's right.
And if you get 2 people who regard their own selfishness as the key problem, you'll have a good marriage. And that's basically true on any relational level. When there's breakdown in a relationship, which is what we have in the US, you've got to regard your own problems as the core problem and then approach the other person with that basic attitude. And that, to me, is the kind of everyday courage that is the making of relationships.
So, and you touched on this a little bit, and I'll ask all of you, that critics have said the perks of leadership become too enticing, that when it comes time to being courageous, that the courage wanes, the comfortable sets in. So how does a leader break out of that? I'm sort of it's funny to think about that. I think right now we all have a mindful app on our smartphone at this very moment, and we don't have any courage apps, right? So suddenly you get called upon to be courageous, and it's like, we don't have a courage practice. So like, what would a courage practice look like? Like, what would you teach other people from your experience, Felix, that is like, this is what you need to be practicing so that when your time comes and you're called, this is what you're going to need to be able to do?
I think it's probably a cliche what I'm about to say, but it's humility. You know, when one of the very unexpected personal relationships, it's moving from a position 5, even 2 years ago, even 100 days ago, in which I was the very uncomfortable voice in the room. Like, Felix, where are you speaking about a crisis? Nicaragua is the country in Central America that's growing, you know, at the fastest GDP growth. What are you always bringing the issue of Ortega? Could you please shut up for a minute? You know, why your radio show, all your articles or your book chapters are about that? And suddenly moving from that position to a position in which I walk and people call me regularly a hero. But for me, a hero, it's the child, the 15-year-old child who on April 18th walked into the Cathedral of Managua to give water to the students who were protesting there. Mm-hmm. He was shot in the throat. He went to a hospital, and the medical doctors refused to attend him, and he died. I mean, for that, that's a hero. Yeah. You see, so when I see that kind of heroism, I try to remind myself every single minute the reason why I left my business, the reason why I put my family at harm. And if you understand deep into yourself, and once again, I bring the issue of moral courage, I think that all the other perks of leadership become completely irrelevant. For example, one of the funny things that I see in social media is when people ask me if I want to run the country, for example. Being absolutely honest, I think who would like to inherit a country that Ortega has developed? It's a country that is being completely disrupted. Families are separated. We're having thousands of paramilitaries that look, you know, closest to ISIS than to the Maras of Honduras. So someone's going to have, you know, that problem. So that's not the kind of problem that I want. So I want to stay as far away as from the traditional perks of leadership as possible and reconnect to the real reason that made me step in the first day that I decided to do so.
You're reminding me of a Polish quote. I think it says, "Not my circus, not my monkeys."
Yes.
But how do you decide, you know what, it actually is my problem? So how do you develop moral courage? How?
Well, you know, in India, you know, when this current government came in, they came in with this sort of adversarial approach to the media, and at least the media that exists. And so I remember being spoken to by somebody in their system, and like, you know, what all of you have done so far is not going to continue. So I said, well, you know what? We are like cockroaches. We survive a nuclear holocaust. So 5 years hence, you may or may not win the next election, but I will still be there covering that. So, you know, there's only so much you can do. And so, yeah. That's something actually I remind myself, but I say this to a lot of people that, you know, if governments bother you or intimidate you, there is an election. They will go.
So I, when I first got my current job as a columnist, I was given a good piece of advice, which is to interview 3 politicians every day. So 3 leaders every day. And I learned that they're all emotional freaks of one sort or another. They have what I call logorrhea dementia. They talk so much they drive themselves insane. They invade your personal space, all that kind of stuff. They touch you and rub you. I'll tell one quick story since it's in Aspen. I was out here and I saw some Secret Service agents on the sidewalk downtown. And I was looking around to see who they were guarding. And there was Clinton, Bill Clinton, on the sidewalk. He was looking at a high school jazz band. And I come over and he starts telling me about the saxophonist. But because he's Clinton, he can't just tell me. He has to knead it into me. He's like arm around me. And because I'm me, I'm like cowering away. And he's like kneading and I'm cowering. So we moved like 40 yards over the course of the song. So anyway, But what I find about them is the number one motivator in their lives is not ambition, it's fear of failure.
Yeah.
They are totally driven by fear of failure. And now why are they driven by that? One, failure in politics really sucks, which is why I admire politicians. They put themselves on the line with the possibility of losing, and when they lose, their whole person has been rejected in the most public way possible. Bob Dole, after he lost the presidential campaign, said, somebody said, is it bad having lost? He said, no, I sleep like a baby. I wake up every 3 hours screaming. And so they are motivated by that fear of failure. And I've noticed among all the Republicans I know who privately detest Trump and publicly radically support him because they just fear failing. And that dominates everything, even their character, it seems. But I found 3 types who overcome that and possess moral courage. Those who have been through something way worse. And so John McCain is an example. One of the few people I've covered, he always had an inner voice. And so even when he betrayed himself for political reasons, he could not lie to himself. He knew it because he'd been through worse. And so the stakes were a little smaller, so he wasn't going to lie to himself. The second are those whose moral identity has somehow been formed so it is not a problem. It's like the Huguenot villages in France who rescued all the Jews during the Holocaust. When people said, well, how did you work up the courage to do it? They said, like, what do you mean? Because their moral identity is, yeah, if somebody comes to the door, we take them in. And I have a friend who has 25 kids from DC living in her basement. And I say, how do you do that? And she said, I don't understand. How do you not do that? And some people are just formed that way. It's their moral identity that's what we do. And that you sort of articulated that a few minutes ago. And then the final thing is just higher love. They love something more than themselves. And so, I think of Mother Teresa, she loved God more than she loved comfort. And we now know from her journals that for 20 years, she didn't sense the presence of God at all. And she still worked on. And she said, my darkness is the thing I get to give. And just she loved something higher than her own personal comfort.
So Darren Walker spoke to us yesterday, and one thing that I was really struck with was this idea that oftentimes leaders end up being surrounded by people that discourage courage. And that's probably one of the hardest things. And certainly, and if we think about weaving, and maybe we'll start this time with you, David, if we think about getting leaders to weave, to actually go to the people they consider other and to start actually being an enterprise with them, it means stepping out of your own group and really actually maybe your group doesn't want you to go weave with those people. And you have a lot of people around you whispering and really discouraging courage. And I just wonder, how would you tell leaders to set themselves up so that they're being encouraged rather than discouraged?
So I once, back in 2006, I interviewed with one other columnist, George W. Bush, in the White House, in the Oval Office. And my colleague and I were hitting him on how badly the war in Iraq was going and how badly it was being fought. And he started screaming at us. And we started pushing back. And he would scream, but in the middle of the screaming, he would say, I want you to know I'm really enjoying this. And he said, nobody ever gives me a bad meeting. And so they police who walks in the door because they don't want him to have a bad meeting, and then he blames the staff. So in my experience, it's never the principal who's the problem, it's always the staff. Yeah. They always want to prevent risk. They think they're going to be blamed. And it's true in the lecture circuit, it's true in the rock business, which I know so much about. But the bands they're not high maintenance divas. It's the people around them who impose difficulty on you. And so their incentive structure is not anti-risk. And so in my experience, if you can get the actual people, they are still human beings. And so what,
But they pick the teams. Those leaders pick those people. True. Like, do you think they pick them and don't know? Do you think they're actually letting them do their dirty work?
Well, there's some of that. Leaders tend to be insecure, so they want people who suck up to them. And so I think it takes a strong leader to force the bad. And actually, at the end of the Bush administration, he picked a chief of staff named Josh Bolten, who did give him bad meetings. And actually, the administration got a lot better in the last 2 years. So it was about
Sounds
that.
like a piece of advice here is you need somebody that gives you a bad meeting.
But, well, I think that's part of it. And the second thing is just being a stranger in a room is so hard. I mean, with the project we're doing with Weave, a lot of what we're doing is walking into rooms with people who are pretty different from us. And one of the things you learn in those rooms is how easy it is to trigger others in ways you're not sensitive to. And you got to walk through that process as they say, no, don't say that. And you got to that's a painful process to walk through. And then I think April Lawson, who is back or sitting over there, one of our colleagues at Weave, is involved in a group called Better Angels, which takes Red American, Blue American, puts them in a room. And it's an education in how hard it is to get people to talk and how frequently they're triggered. And so I think April has learned that for some of the Reds, the people from Red America, words like dialogue are problematic. It's like, you're going to scream at me. And the word like dialogue in some communities is not a problematic word, and vice versa. And so there's just a lot of language you have to crash through.
Indrani, how do people make sure they have people who will give them the bad meeting and that they surround themselves by people that encourage rather than discourage courage?
Well, I don't think they start out by thinking that they need that bad meeting. And therefore, the people surrounding them feed off that particular ecosystem, that every meeting must be perfectly choreographed and perfectly turned out. And we've interviewed the previous prime minister. This prime minister doesn't like to be interviewed by us, but the previous prime minister we've interviewed, and the one before him. It's not been perfect, but I think they were a little more open to speaking about or defending their positions. The previous prime minister, I remember we interviewed him on the way back from Washington, actually. It was a visit when India signed a nuclear deal with the US, and which sort of broke pretty much every precedent and everything that everybody had stood for 40 years, 50 years prior. So it was important, for him to be able to actually say why it was important to him. But he could say that in that little aircraft with 5 of us. He would never be able to say that in a full press conference because what the hell, his party wouldn't have allowed him to do that. So it was not him, and I get what David says. It's not just the principle, it's everything around him. And well, of course, this one is in a different place all by himself, but even here, I mean, I know I have run into him several times and had a conversation in a one-on-one space, which has been a perfectly rational conversation. You've asked questions, you've pushed back, and he has answered, etc. But that doesn't happen in a bigger situation, in a larger situation, in a press conference. He'd never do a press conference, and then it becomes kind of that, oh, the prime minister told me, and that then becomes a completely different set of conversation. So yeah, so we do push back. I mean, it's not that we don't. Just in the last 1 week, the leader of the opposition, actually of the opposition party, he did a press conference with 100 women journalists, and so I think social media in India is now full of the fact that the prime minister has not done anything of the sort, and the leader of the opposition has. So I suspect sooner or later you'll find the prime minister doing a sanitized version of a press conference, but whatever.
All right, Felix, I'm going to change the question for you, and then I'm going to open it up to the room. So what, as a leader who's stepping out, how can people encourage your courage? it seems like probably a lot of people are like, hey, tell me if you need something, which is a little bit like not that useful probably. So like, but what would actually be useful besides like, let me know if you need anything. Like what else could this community do, other communities that you run with? Like what do you really need as a leader who's in the middle of it to keep your courage up?
Well, thank you for the question. First of all, is connecting to the issue. In this case, it's Nicaragua. It's a big difference to traditional political leadership when you want the person to be the issue. So it's really hard to ask everyone not to help me. I'm extremely privileged. I'm sitting here. I'm not in a prison like my dear friend Medardo Mairena, who was flying with me together with Pedro Mena. We're flying together. Both of them got arrested because they bought the plane ticket the day before. I bought the ticket right on the spot on the counter, so I like to think that God plus that little trick helped me to be here. I was stepping right out of the hospital so I could join you and be here. So the ask would be to focus on the issue, try to really connect to what my motivation is. So in my case, it's a question that I ask myself also when I try to help others. I try to be respectful of the fears of others. I don't like to push them because we all have different risk appetites. For example, in my case, having been a foster child, having been a refugee at age 12 here in the United States, that's incredible privilege, So everything I have now, it's way more than I ever dreamed. But for most people in Nicaragua who come from privilege, some asks that I had, now that I think about it, probably were too risky, because for them the benchmark was different. So in order to connect with the issue, and try to share the same love and passion for what we're trying, in this case, what we're trying to do, which is save Nicaragua and save lives.
Thank you. All right, presumably I have people running around with mics. Why do I not see running? Running. All right. I know there are questioning people. Yes.
I have 3 glasses of wine.
Oh, perfect.
Say it.
That is great.
So, thank you. I'm glad that.
Do you have a name in addition to 3 glasses of wine? I hate for you to be known like that. for the
I'm
rest of
Renata
the time.
Soto. I'm in Nashville, Tennessee. I'm a Costa Rican native, and I'm a Pahara fellow. So my question is, I guess both for Alex and David. Many of us social entrepreneurs and change makers here in this room, I'm sure, have been asked, when are you going to run for office? As a next platform for creating the change that you want to see in your community. And David, so you speak about, okay, people in politics, sort of all the shortcomings that you see in them. So why should we be encouraged to see that as a platform for change in our communities if we are not narcissistic enough, if, like all the things that you enumerated that might not be how we think of ourselves, but that we know that the public sector and changing policy is probably one of the places where we can change the systems that from the private sector, either as nonprofits or entrepreneurs, we're trying to see. So what would you say to people that are grasping that question of throwing yourself to run for something in your community, either a school board or Congress to make it to the Senate in the US to change your community and your country?
Well, to give you the 4 reasons I try to persuade my students to run for office and get involved in politics. The first thing I tell them is if you don't care about politics, that's a sign that you're privileged enough to live in a society where you don't have to care about politics. If you live in Nicaragua right now, you do not have that luxury because they're shooting at college students. So that's the first thing. The second thing I say is you can do a lot of good as a social entrepreneur, as an entrepreneur, but the people I know who have done the most good were in politics. So I have a friend in the Bush administration who helped start PEPFAR, the anti-HIV program in Africa. And so that guy helped save 13 million lives. That's just a massive change of scale that only politics has because the numbers in politics are so good and so big. I have a friend in government, and when I talk to my friends who used to be in government, they talk about those periods in politics, in government, as really the crowded hours of their life, the crucial moments in their life. And one of them, a friend of mine who was in the Obama administration, says, every individual day sucked, but the whole experience was tremendously rewarding. And that's a common thing I hear. And so just, you can do it. There are a lot of NGOs in Haiti. There are a lot of NGOs around the world. If you don't get law and order right, if you don't get politics right, there's just only so much good that can happen. And so the scale of change is just way bigger. The third thing I say is that politics demands character and perspective. The Greeks were right about this. They thought nobody's really a full human being unless they're involved in public life. Because you have to pay attention to other people. You have to take a broad global perspective. You have to exercise prudence. You have to exercise courage. The highest virtues are exercised by those in political life. And it's super hard. When you go interview a senior politician or president, you always come away thinking, there's no way I could do that job. It's just too hard. And then the final reason is that the craft of politics is actually a very beautiful craft and very practical. If anybody saw this movie, Lincoln, with Daniel Day-Lewis, it's about politics. It's about cutting deals, knowing how to manipulate people, knowing how to work the system. And we treat that as a low thing. But it's actually a very beautiful thing. You can organize society around two ways, one through force and one through compromise. And you get to pick one of those two. And I had a friend who worked at a low level in the first Bush administration, and he told me the story. He used to love these stories of people who knew how to do politics. And one of the stories he told me was about a guy named Mel Laird. Mel Laird was Secretary of Defense under Richard Nixon. Mel Laird had no hair, completely bald. But there was a barber in the White House in those days, and every week on Wednesday afternoon at 3, he would schedule an appointment with the barber in the White House. So why would he do that? Because in the Pentagon, where he worked, the secretary's schedule went out to everybody in the building. And so it would say at 3 p.m. on Wednesday, Laird to White House. So they would think he was meeting with the president. It was just the barber. But so he was playing the game. And I have tremendous respect for people who play the game that way.
Felix, did you want to add anything to why run for office? Other than you don't think you're going to run for office?
Well, in the specific context of countries that are highly divided, I like to think of that principle of love thy brother as you like to love yourself. And I think that in the case of Nicaragua, we have a disruptive relationship with leadership. So I simply, as a citizen, as a potential voter, and probably someday as a politician, I would like to be, led with the same principle. Lead others as you would like to be led. So I just hope that our Cali fellows who have a fantastic pool of talent, someone will step in, because I've been doing this job for 11 years now, and it's tired. So I join with you in the invitation, so more people will take that step.
Some reinforcements.
The new
Yes,
generation.
we need reinforcements.
Reinforcements. All right. Next question. Really?
Everybody agrees with
I've
everything.
seen you people all day long. All you do is ask questions.
Hi, thanks. My name is Mara. And David, I know you're very focused on polarization and tribalism. And I'm curious in terms of kind of the conversations that we've had today and where we are in the world and in 3 different contexts. Just kind of an analysis of how do we move forward and how do we actually find issues where we can unite people in common cause and create unity to actually move our politics forward in a very difficult time.
So how do we move forward and at a time when politics is actually much more polarizing, much more divisive than it used to be? I think one of the ways that we move forward, at least in democracies, is to be true to the principles of democracy. Because one of the things that democracy does is it's a great leveler in terms of politics. You really cannot become too tough, too divisive, too authoritarian without the system pushing back. And as long as those principles and as long as those norms of democracy sustain, we have less to worry about. It is when we tinker with the principles that govern us as democracies that we need to worry about. And that comes from not just an authoritarian, loving, elected leader. I read somewhere that elected leaders are worse for democracies these days, apparently, than unelected leaders, which is outrageous. But as long as you remain within the bounds of democracy, of democratic practice and democratic principles, you will always, your compass, your political compass will always be true north. And even if you have diversions, etc. In India in 75, we had 2 years of emergency. It's a 2-year period that remains a nightmare in the country. And despite despite politics that may be majoritarian sometimes, that may pick on issues that are truly the lowest common denominator, even in those times, that one memory of those 2 years when the Constitution was suspended, Indians over generations, and we've had about 3 generations since then, have remembered those 2 years, and despite all the vagaries of your politics and everything, we've always remained within the bounds of democracy. And I think that's something that we should all be proud of, every democracy.
My answer would be that there's no political solution to this political problem, that it's a cultural and intellectual problem and a moral problem. And my basic view is that we had a culture back in the 40s and 50s which was very community-oriented and pretty conformist. And in some ways it was a great culture. It was a lot of community, a lot of modesty, a lot of humility, a lot of cohesion. But it had some failures. It tolerated a lot of racism, a lot of sexism, a lot of anti-Semitism. The food was really boring back then. And so people chopped it up. And they chopped it up for a system that allowed individual liberation. And that created a lot of opportunity. It created a lot of freedom for people, a lot of individual freedom. And it developed into a philosophy, a mindset, which was an individualistic autonomy mindset. I shape my own values. So go to any commencement speech. What do they say? Find your own passion. March to the beat of your own drummer. You do you. It's all about you. There's a book they give away at these commencements called Oh, the Places You'll Go, this Dr. Seuss book. It's the story of life as an individual person who's completely unattached and alone, going through life and leading life as an Instagram adventure, just a series of individual experiences. And that became the culture in which we were raised. And so what was heaven for our grandparents has become our hell. We took individualism, which is kind of a good idea. We ran out the string on it over 40 years. And we're stuck with the excesses of individualism. So we need a mind shift, a shift in attitude, and we're not going to go back to that old authoritarian culture. So we need some response to individualism, which is about commitment and which is about community. And so to me, somehow you have to find ways, either through books, and books and ideas have power to shift people's minds, or through examples. And if you can show ways of people who are living in a way that is communal and not individual, like we all have that phrase, live for something larger than yourself. But a lot of people, every young person I know wants to do that. What does that look like? How do you do that? What ideas do you need? These are answers that can be provided by example. And so using people really as literature to change people's minds and give them an alternative to an individualistic mindset, to me, that's the way forward.
Hold on, they're coming. They're coming. They're going through the obstacle course. It's coming. There it is. Yay!
Okay. Elizabeth Farrow, Henry Crown Dare Greatly class. I want to pick up on David's question to his students and ask the panel, what would you do if you weren't afraid?
If you weren't afraid.
David, your other 2 panelists right now have a thought bubble that's like, why did David say that? You see that?
Yeah.
You see it's like the thought bubble's out of their heads, like,
Yes.
Thanks, David.
You can
So we'll
start.
make David go first. You're right. That's really what should happen.
That's, I talked about intimacy. I mean, I'm still a person who you know, if you're I was at this TED Talk, and this woman named Susan Cain got up there. She wrote this book, Quiet, I think. And she said, okay, we're all going to turn to the person next to you, and I want you to reveal a deep, dark secret about yourself and then to the other person. And I went, oh, no. And she said, if you just went, oh, no, you're an introvert. And so, you know, most of my fears come from when somebody opens up to me with a vulnerable situation, and I don't know what to say. And sometimes, I really work on this. I used to be a person nobody confided in because I was just moved. There was an invisible shell that people could see that I was moving. And so I work really hard to try not to be that person. Like I gave a talk here at Aspen Ideas, and a woman came up to me and said, my son died in a car crash, and I'm a mathematician. I want to know why. And like, of course I didn't know what to say. And I've learned that the first thing you do is hug the person. And so that's actually really hard for me, just given my background. And so and I've still got so far to go in that. And I'll pass on a really good piece of advice. Other people probably know this. I had a friend who was, her sister had died. She had worked for Ashoka in Afghanistan, and she died in a horseback riding accident. And she herself nearly died in a bike accident. And I visited her with her mom, who was nursing her back to health over 6 months. And Anna was the woman who died. And the woman said to me, you know, when people meet me, they want to know if they should mention Anna or not. Will they bring up a bad subject to my mind and put me in a bad mood? And she said, they should know that Anna is always on my mind, and therefore mention it. And if I feel like saying something, I will. If I don't, I won't. And so that was like, that practical bit of advice was super useful to me. And then the second thing she said was, you know what was the best moment of our illness? People would come over. Well, the worst moments are when they compare. I know what it's like to have your daughter die. I had my dog die last week. Like, never compare, never compare. But the best moment was outside their shower. She said they didn't have a bath mat. They were too busy to get it. Somebody noticed this, took their bike off to Target, bought a bath mat, and just put it down. Practical help of a very concrete sort was the best help in a moment of trauma. And so getting that kind of advice is, weirdly for me, these are the things I think about when I think about fear, just these kind of social intimacy issues.
Well, if I wasn't afraid, I would join politics. I would run for office. But I am. And so I won't join politics. When I look at politicians and I think, you know what, I could do this, and I can do this better than you. I have skills, I have those skills, I have better skills than you, but I'm afraid. And if I wasn't, that would be another story.
Beautiful. So I see fear as something unproductive that fills your emotional space. So if I had less fear, because I think that we all have some types of fear, I think my heart will have more room for love, more room for compassion, and more capacity to have honest conversations with those that disagree with me. Because I think that that's what the world is missing. We need to not only having a conversation trying to persuade, but trying to understand. I was sharing with the group today that when in one of the very uncomfortable situations, I was in an office and suddenly a whole bunch of people broke the door, and this guy put a gun on my head, and the guy was crying. I could see his face. I mean, the media covered as if someone had paid him to do that, but the lady right next to him said, don't kill that piece of trash, you know? And they were, because he created all this revolt. And I, honestly, if I had no fear, I would have hugged that guy. Because he honestly thought that I created a revolt that disrupted a revolution that he had created. So if I had no fear, I would definitely try to deeply understand, not persuade, but understand those who disagree with me.
All right, so one place it seems like we really need courage, and it seems really hard to find, is when the fight is over. Somebody won, somebody lost, and now you got to figure out where you are. So I had a girlfriend call me up a few weeks ago, and she was like, hey, can you meet this guy? He wants some advice about getting into PR. You know, you like to talk to people. And I was like, sure. And then she said his name, and I realized it was one of the guys that was on the shitty media men's list. And I was like, you know what I do for a living, right? To my girlfriend. And she was like, yeah, he just really needs some help. And I was like, okay. So I met him out in public. And I remember, like, I was definitely, like, my whole face was a little bit like, you will find no quarter here. And, but it was really interesting because as he was talking, and he's obviously being incredibly reflective now and in therapy and other things, and but he really seemed quite genuine in understanding that he had created this horrible climate. And I started to really think about it, and I do work on criminal justice a lot, and I literally constantly say people should not be judged on their worst day. And so suddenly I realized I was this huge hypocrite. Like, I was ready, he's 35, and I was like, you'll never work in this town again. And like, and meanwhile, like, I'm telling everybody else, like, you should totally hire these people coming out of jail. And so, so I was really just faced with this idea, though, but I also sort of felt like I did not know what his redemptive path would be. I honestly couldn't see how he was actually going to get a job again. And it just really struck me that a big part of courage is after. And now we have to come back as a society, and something bad happened, something horrible happened. And what is your role then as a leader? If you were leading the fight, then you have to turn around maybe and lead the healing. So how do you do that?
So I used to go on the Charlie Rose show, and Charlie Rose is one of those guys. And so he called, and I've had that same thing. Do I talk to him? And it seemed to me you have to talk to him. And in the synagogue in D.C. where I used to go, there used to be a show where they would lure guys who were interested in child abuse, and then they would unveil them. When they walked in, they'd say, you can come to this house, there'll be children here for you. And then when they got there, TV cameras came on and they were busted. And one of those guys was a rabbi in the D.C. area. And he went to jail for 10 years, and then he wanted to come back and worship somewhere. And so the synagogue had that debate, do we let him back in? And a woman I know who's a great teacher, she said, of course you do. That's exactly what we're told to do. And I think that's my attitude. No matter what, everybody's redeemable. And so of course you do. And the only thing I think you can walk through with them is some people shrink from suffering and some people expand from it. And how do you take suffering and turn it into something productive? And those who, the one thing there's a great quote I love from Paul Tillich. He says, moments of suffering remind you you're not who you thought you were. They unveil all the masks you built up and show you're something else. And then what suffering does, he says, is carve through the floor of what you thought was the basement of your soul and reveal a cavity below, and carve through that and reveal a cavity below. And you realize you have voids down there that nothing but spiritual food can fill. And so the people who are enlarged by suffering take the moment of suffering and connect it to a narrative of redemption. And so they take that suffering and they turn their life on that moment and they seek to become healers of that illness. And so even if you know people I have friends who lost a child when he was 5, and they didn't say, oh, hey, we grieved for 2 years, let's party, let's make up for it. Their whole life is a foundation which is about the illness that their child suffered from. And so there are people who use that suffering and, as they say, didn't come back with empty hands. And I think that's true even of, we all hate Harvey Weinstein and people like that. But if you think it's true of one, it's got to be true for all, unless they prove you different.
Well, there's something about suffering or coming out of loss, and how you not redeem yourself, but how do you bring yourself together? Well, I saw this firsthand. I lost my mother in a car accident a couple of years ago. It was quite horrible. But the thing was, my dad, they were going to a tiger sanctuary, and they were hit by a bus. The thing is, my dad placed her in the best seat in the SUV, and he sat in the most uncomfortable seat behind. and he was untouched, and she was gone. So for him, and so whatever so to cut a long story short, it wasn't that I wasn't grieving for my mother. It was that I had to hold my dad, that he could, so his survivor's guilt and his grief together would not sort of break him apart. And I think I saw him actually, I think it was a remarkable how he brought himself back in a year. It took him a year to do this, but, and that, I took that back as a huge life lesson of coming out of it just sort of came out of the blue, right? So that was something that I thought was interesting.
Yeah.
So in the context where I come from, is a context of highly divided societies. I think that the hard part of leading is to protect your sacred heart in sort of way. So you will not hate, because I think that when you lead in such context, you have to have an honest capacity to exercise the example that you gave in politics. In the case of Nicaragua, will be a massive capacity for healing, and I think that only someone in position of power could do that, because I think that in the world of politics, it's so common to pick a sort of your political market and dividing people by ideologies, by color, by brands is the easiest way to do politics. So the hardest part of leadership from where I come from is not becoming part of a brand, and remembering that the most beautiful brand that we all have, it's that we are all humans.
Yeah, that is very nice. All right, I'm going to wrap up, and I've now decided we're definitely going to get a courage app. So you guys are going to be our guide. So I need everybody to sort of scooch in your chairs. You have to put your feet on the floor. Okay, so you know how like the mindfulness app, it'll say like, okay, Kristen, I want you to welcome the thoughts into your head, say hello to them, and then let them float away. So I want you guys to give us our one line on courage. So I'm going to start with you, then you, then you. And we'll end the evening with a little a courage app. So here we go. Are you ready, Felix? Okay, I'm breathing in. I'm ready, go.
Courage is compassion.
Indrani?
Courage is doing what seems right at the moment.
There's no courage better than liquid courage. I'll see you all at the bar.
That was the best one.
Thank you very much. Thank you.